Welcome, everyone. My name is Jeff Green. I'm the director of the Andre Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy. And I'm very pleased to be with you today as we have our event with Matt Schaefer entitled Silence is Violence and So is Speech, Language and Power Since the Reagan Years. Today is the latest and indeed final installment of the Mitchell Center's year-long series on free speech battles. Every year at the Mitchell Center, there's a faculty workshop series. This is the 14th annual installment of that series. And this year, we've been investigating the question of free speech in various contexts. It's been a very special year for obvious reasons. The first year the Mitchell Center has conducted the faculty workshop series on Zoom. It's had some upsides. It's allowed us, I think, to include at least as many people as normally from an audience perspective, and certainly from a wider swath of the world than we ordinarily would do. It's also, though, been a very special year, I think, because of the cohesiveness that has shaped the Free Speech Battle series. And I mean cohesiveness, first of all, from the perspective of the leadership of the series. We've been very lucky to have as the program director of the Free Speech Battle series, Sigal Ben-Porath, and she's put together a planning committee that's worked together for a year or two prior to this year's events, and of course, working to execute the events this year, that themselves have been very cooperative and engaged through most of the events over the last year. And so that planning committee, in addition to Sigal, includes Sophie Rosenfeld, Amy Sepinwall, Joe Lowry, my colleague Matt Roth from the Mitchell Center, and Tukufu Zuberi. It's also, though, been cohesive this Free Speech Battles year in its content. I think every month we've investigated something that could be something unto itself, and yet something that clearly connects thematically to the other month's topics. Just a review for you today on our final event of the Free Speech Battle series, all that we've investigated together. We opened in September with a multi-day conference on free speech within academic settings. And then in October, we had two events, one investigating the challenges facing the independent news media with outgoing CEO of the New York Times, Mark Thompson. And later that month, we investigated white supremacist hate speech, what causes it and how it might be overcome, with former white supremacist Derek Black. Later in the fall semester, we had an event on the vexing issue of boycotts and their connection to matters of speech. And we concluded the fall semester with an event on digital and online speech and the specific and special concerns that relate to that growing platform. This current semester that's coming to a close this week at Penn, we began with an event on the politics of free expression in India. After that, we did one on the history of the First Amendment in the United States and the way that American free speech jurisprudence may in fact be importantly different from that of other nations. Last month, we had an event on the question of whether and how the state might play a more active role in the regulation of misinformation, with special attention to the case of Singapore. And earlier this month, we had an event on the issue about whether lying on the presidential level is especially egregious and especially deserving of public regulation, and if so, how? All these events are different, but they're also clearly connected. They're about free speech, they're about ongoing debates regarding it, and they're occurring within contexts not usually limited to courts and jurisprudential matters, but rather more broadly connected to the quotidian experiences of everyday life, to novel venues connected to the internet revolution we're living through today, how online developments are transforming matters of speech, and more broadly interconnected with economic, social, and political developments of our time. But it's not over. The series is not over. We have one final event, and that event is coming in the form of Matt Schaefer, who has been the postdoctoral fellow at the Mitchell Center this year, connected to the free speech battles theme. Those of you who have been part of the series this year will know Matt from his various forms of engagement in the series and in the Mitchell Center. He's moderated events as part of the Free Speech Battle series. He's helped to organize some of them, and he's been extraordinarily helpful and proactive in making the series run as smoothly as can be. It's been a pleasure working with Matt, also in other regards in the Mitchell Center. We've co-taught a class together, and I know he's teaching his own class this semester that has been very well received. And later this week, Matt will be doing another event at the Mitchell Center where he presents his recently completed book manuscript on the topic of what violence was. That's the title. That will be this Friday at the Mitchell Center. Matt recently got his PhD at Yale last year in political theory. He's the author of numerous works in prominent publications, and again, has just completed his first book manuscript on the title, What Violence Was. Next year, he'll be heading off to the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, a rather remarkable place to be at such an early moment in your career, Matt. Congratulations on that. And thank you for being such a wonderful participant and colleague this year. I look forward to the discussion we're going to have as you present to us on silence is violence and so is speech, language and power since the Reagan years. Let me just say to those of you in the audience, we'll be fielding questions from you, so use the Q&A function in your Zoom, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. So Matt, thank you for being here. I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Jeff. It's a real pleasure to be here at this final event in the Free Speech Battles series. I'd like to thank the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy, not only for hosting this discussion today, but for their year-long fellowship support of my research. And I'd particularly like to thank Jeff Green and Sigal Ben-Porath for their really wonderful scholarly collaboration and intellectual friendship over the past months. I've had really an amazing year here. Today, I'm gonna talk about language and about violence. If you spend much time listening to or participating in activist and academic debates about culture, speech, and identity today, you'll likely eventually encounter the idea that silence is violence. And you'll also encounter the idea that speech can be violent as well. These claims, silence is violence, but so is speech, juxtaposed in this way, they can feel like a contradiction, like a tension, or even maybe like an outright confusion of ideas. But I want to argue today that this claim, silence is violence and so is speech, that it's intelligible, and that the evident tension between its two parts is a product of and a useful entrance into the broader uncertainties and the ambiguities of language and the politics of language in our time. In 1929, the Soviet philosopher Valentin Voloshinov wrote that every word we speak is an index of social changes. For, as he put it, a word in the mouth of a particular individual person is a product of the living interaction of social forces. In a way, the history of the many debates about the politics of language that have unfolded in both European and American intellectual life in the decades since, those can be understood as a history of different perspectives on how Voloshinov's claim could be true. Those debates rage on still today. We see them in activism and in academia, in arguments over free expression and its limits, in contested ideas like hate speech and microaggression and implicit bias. You know, whether we're in the classroom or in the public square, it's hard to encounter these debates, I think, without feeling as though they're simultaneously filled with insight and with contradiction. They pull us between competing ethical demands and contrasting political dreams. To understand these contemporary controversies, I think it's worth looking back at the history of debates about violence more generally. Because the question we should really start with, I think, is this: how and why did we begin thinking about language as a space of violence at all? The idea that there's a violence of language, it's a relatively new idea, regardless of whether it emphasizes linguistic silence or linguistic expression. Up until around the 1960s, the word violence in English language political thought was used almost exclusively to refer to illegal forms of bodily harm or property destruction or public disorder. Now, the emphasis there is on illegal. In Anglophone philosophy, and in English language political debate more broadly, there was usually a really sharp distinction between violence and force. Force was understood as what the state or the police uses to maintain order, and violence is whatever runs counter to legal authority. This kind of identification of violence with non-state illegal forms of action. That was so strong in the American context that as late as 1972, something like 1/4 of Americans considered sit-ins to be a form of violence. Sit-ins. Now today, of course, we almost universally regard sit-ins as a paradigmatic kind of nonviolent political activity. The fact that there was such ambiguity in this kind of apparently straightforward definitional question just 50 years ago, that's a sign, I think, both of how much instability there is in how words like violence are defined. And it's also a mark of the significance of concrete political struggle in shaping how the meanings of our most basic terms change over time. The end of the 1960s and the beginning of the 70s was a period of really radical change in how we used the word violence. That old consensus that violence was just a synonym for illegal, disorderly behavior, that was being called into question by both scholars and activists. In large part, this was precisely because of the new prominence of forms of social action that proclaimed their nonviolence while nevertheless openly and deliberately breaking the law. So civil disobedience was often coercive, but it wasn't violent. And in this way, it challenged that old identification of violence with illegality. Political theorists and social philosophers took up that challenge really eagerly. And they did that in two basic ways. On the one hand, they pushed against the idea that violence is only definitionally a matter of non-state activity. So they started challenging that old distinction between violence and force. So for example, they would argue that we should also regard police activities as violent. And in this way, the question became not a matter of distinguishing between force, good, and violence, bad, right? Rather, it became a matter of distinguishing between justified and unjustified uses of violence, whatever violence is. But on the other hand, theorists also pushed against the idea that direct force in particular was the only or the best model for violence more broadly. They started wondering whether other kinds of social power that shape people's everyday lives might maybe also embody certain kinds of violence, maybe because of their cumulative effects. This is where ideas like structural violence came from, right? So discriminatory institutions, for example, could be understood as a kind of violence at the aggregate level because of what they do over time. So what does this have to do with language? Well, when violence was thought of as illegal, destructive activity, it was hard to see it as a part of language at all. Think of John Stuart Mill's classic 19th century defense of free speech in liberal societies. So if the liberal democratic state can't interfere with individuals unless they're harming each other, it might seem like the only kinds of speech that the state can legitimately regulate are direct incitements to violence or destruction. Language itself isn't harmful on this view, except when you're literally challenging someone to a fight or shouting fire in the proverbial theater. That was basically the gist of Mill's harm principle as it applied to language. Violence and language were seen as practically opposites. And that kind of idea is still defended by figures like Hannah Arendt into the 1960s. But the rise of nonviolence made the old understanding of violence itself less compelling. As the idea of violence started changing in new ways, right? As the concept of violence became a tool for criticizing power in all kinds of social spheres, that old Mill-style harm principle consensus, it just became quite simply less obvious. There were two different ways that this happened. Two different frameworks for rethinking the politics of language. Each of them posed a new challenge to the old idea that language and violence are almost opposites. So one framework starts from the terminology of discourse and power. The other emphasizes speech acts and harm. Both of these frameworks go back to the 60s and 70s, but they emerged from different intellectual traditions. And I want to say something about both of them in turn. The perspective of discourse and power, that framework had its origins in the collapse of the Marxist project of ideology critique. So there had been a whole intellectual world of Marxian theorists, including in France and West Germany and in the Anglophone countries, figures who were as critical of the Stalinist state as they were of Western capitalism. And these figures had devoted really sustained attention across the 20th century to analyzing how cultural and linguistic practices and norms can shape political and economic domination. Ideology was the key category for this kind of approach. But for complicated reasons, the Marxian theory of ideology entered a period of real crisis in the decades after the Second World War. New theories of discourse rose to fill the gap. And these discourse theories provided fresh perspectives on how language could operate as a sphere of power in a structural or systemic sense. Figures like Michel Foucault and Gayatri Spivak advanced really incisive and influential analyses of these kinds of dynamics. They introduced new concepts like power knowledge and epistemic violence. And these ideas helped understand how large-scale patterns of intelligibility and unintelligibility, or processes of communication and distortion, or patterns of representation and misrepresentation, how those kinds of dynamics shape the conditions of our everyday lives. Now, these approaches to discourse and power, they offered fundamental insights. They illuminated how the very terms in which political problems and social questions are expressed, how the terms of analysis themselves can make certain forms of power more difficult to contest. And they also showed how systematic silence, the way certain things are made more difficult to say at all, how that could also let oppression run free. What was remarkable about this approach was that it helped people analyze their everyday conditions in ways that connected individual experience to wider and deeper processes, right? Connecting the dots to dynamics whose origins were really beyond any one person's deeds or misdeeds. These were fundamentally systemic theories. They did for language what ideas like structural violence had done for inequality. They showed how real injuries could be produced through the operation of kinds of power that transcend the actions or the intentions of individuals, including of elites. So the idea of structural violence was a kind of model for this approach to talking about the violence of language in terms of discourse and power. And I would argue that more broadly, the new approaches to defining violence from this whole period, the new ways of thinking about violence beyond its old association with illegal activity, that was part of what made the new theories of language possible. Violence as a concept or as a terminology was available for these new uses. Academics and activists were already using the idea of violence to organize all kinds of new approaches to understanding entire social spheres, spheres that had once been regarded as outside of politics entirely, spheres like domestic life or sexuality. Language is also a sphere of power. New ideas of linguistic violence could help show why this is the case and what it means. But structural theories can also make certain kinds of personal reflection more difficult. Their political strength can be their ethical weakness. If a theory tells us that violence can exist in language without any particular violent person to hold accountable, what should we conclude about how to act morally, right? And so a quite different perspective on language arose in the same period to address those kinds of questions more directly. And this was the perspective of speech and harm. This framework had its intellectual origins in a mostly separate academic tradition, which was Anglo-American analytical philosophy. In the 1960s, a British philosopher named J.L. Austin developed a theory of what he called speech acts. This really quickly and fundamentally reshaped Anglophone philosophy of language. Austin's deep insight was that not all uses of our words are just descriptive or communicative. Sometimes in speaking, we perform an action. We don't just describe it. So his now like really classic example was the I do of the wedding ceremony, right? When I say I do, I'm not just describing the fact that I'm getting married. I'm not just communicating something about the marriage. I'm actually causing the marriage to come into existence by saying I do. Austin's theory of what he called performative speech, which he sort of built out of examples like this, it had really profound effects across the humanities as a whole for many decades. It reshaped disciplines like philosophy and legal studies and critical race theory and feminist and queer theory. And it was just one piece, but a really important piece of a sort of broader turn to looking at the situated significance of rhetoric in everyday life, right? Understanding speech as a tool for changing and affecting concrete situations, not just for communicating about them. Austin's influential book was called How to Do Things with Words. As other scholars developed his ideas further, it became widely understood that if words can be deeds, then they can also be harms. The theory of speech acts became a fundamental influence on debates over questions like the censorship of pornography and the regulation of racial slurs. By paying attention to what words do beyond what they merely say, new questions about the moral and political dimensions of language, of linguistic activity, those questions could be asked and answered in new ways. But in its pure form, the speech and harm approach that resulted, it exactly inverted the strengths and the weaknesses of the discourse and power paradigm. The attention to individual behavior, right? This focus on personal agency, making that the site of language's force could risk making the systemic or the structural sometimes harder to see. Both of these frameworks, discourse and power, speech and harm, they're both still with us today. It's in large part the tension between them that makes our contemporary debates about the politics of language feel so fraught. Silence is violence, and so is speech. Our cultural fights now about language are so full of promise and peril because they play out in the unstable space between these two competing frameworks. Now, as I think should now be clear, this tension between opposing perspectives or paradigms, it's not a fight just between the left and the right. It's not a contradiction between liberty and equality. It's not a contrast between censorship or cancel culture, so-called, or expression or free speech. This isn't even a conflict between defenders of John Stuart Mill and his opponents, right? That would be an anachronistic framing. The tension instead is internal to each of our major political alignments. It cuts through them at a deeper level. It shapes the very terms in which we ask our questions about language and violence at all. Now, in principle, we could imagine that the two frameworks might complement each other rather nicely. Right, with discourse, we have a picture of systemic power, and with speech, a picture of individual harms. But in practice, the relationship between these two approaches has always been more complex, and it's often been conflictual. There are philosophical and theoretical sources for the tensions between the two paradigms, conceptual dilemmas that could fill a whole library of scholarly monographs. But more significant are the material processes that destabilize any simple or straightforward union of the two perspectives. For reasons that have as much to do with the dynamics of real-world politics as with our internal psychological complexities. It's proven extraordinarily difficult to hold together the critique of systemic power and the analysis of individual behavior within a coherent, overarching, ethical, political perspective. The result is that most of our debates about language and its politics are now caught in between the two paradigms. They never quite align fully or exactly with one or the other. Debates about hate speech, for example, often move uneasily between a structural critique of white supremacy and a behavioral analysis of prejudiced interaction. Accounts of silencing shift back and forth between systemic theories of marginalization and situated accounts of interpersonal disrespect. And silence itself can be seen as violence in either sense. Silence can be seen as a kind of structural violence when we lack the resources even to name or to contest a particular kind of power. Or silence can be seen as a kind of personal violence when we decline to speak, even though our words could have beneficial effects. It's tempting to say that what we need is just a sharper philosophical analysis of the ideas that are at stake in these debates, right? Something like a smoother translation of terms between the competing approaches, or maybe a more careful effort to philosophically combine the individual and the structural, the ethical, the political, right? So the question might be, maybe we can just come up with a better definition of violence, one that would make sense of the confusions, or maybe a sharper concept of harm. In some academic quarters, that's been a popular approach. But in my view, attempts to resolve such social dilemmas through more rigorous conceptualization are unlikely to succeed. The world itself has changed dramatically since these frameworks were first formulated. And the historical conditions that they initially responded to just no longer exist in the same way. The political and the social and the economic landscape is different. And it's those differences, those developments, that have made the space between the two frameworks so unstable today. So this is where we move from the title of my talk, Silence is Violence and So is Speech, to the subtitle, Language and Power Since the Reagan Years. I mean the reference to Reagan as a kind of shorthand for a whole complex of social and economic processes that have reshaped how we understand the relationship between, on the one hand, the politics of systemic power and the ethics of individual activity on the other. So what I mean in particular is what social and political theorists often call neoliberalism. Now, this is a tricky term in itself. Neoliberalism has as many definitions as violence does. So let me be clear about the particular sense in which I'm using it here. In my research, I'm interested in neoliberalism as a sort of heuristic category for describing processes of social individualization that correspond really closely to how the model of the market has come to dominate more and more areas of social life. So I'm drawing here on the work of scholars like David Harvey and Wendy Brown. Both of them have examined really influentially how political and economic processes like austerity politics or the financialization of the economy as a whole, how those kinds of developments have helped shore up in turn a really sort of utilitarian, individualistic kind of everyday common sense. And it's one that shapes our lives even outside of our actual economic activities. For these scholars, and in my own view as well, a kind of calculative hyper-individualism has seeped more and more into everyday life. It's one of the social effects of the economic changes associated in part with the Reagan-Thatcher years on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, one effect of this kind of individualization of political common sense is that theories of the structural or the systemic correspond less and less to our everyday social experience and our everyday moral imagination. In my work, I argue this. as this kind of neoliberal individualism shapes public debate broadly, it also ends up having deep effects on scholarly and intellectual life. Theories that aim at the critique of power become more intelligible, more circulatable, more compelling, to the degree that their claims about power can be translated into ethical ideas about individual behavior. Forms of power that fundamentally exceed or transcend individuated interaction, those kinds of phenomena will tend to fade into the background. Instead, the analysis of differential privilege or empowerment of individuals will more and more take the place of the critique of structure itself. I think we can see this kind of dynamic in contemporary debates about the politics of language. Theories of linguistic violence seem more directly intelligible today when they have to do with particular kinds of speech rather than broad patterns of discourse. In this turn to individual behavior, there are significant ethical insights. This kind of theory of linguistic violence lets us identify forms of rhetorical disrespect and marginalization that have been unrecognized for far too long. And as a result, we can better imagine how these significant forms of harm could be remedied or prevented. But when the possibility of regulating these harms substitutes for a critique of the kinds of power that make them possible in the first place, we risk opposing ethics and politics rather than holding them together in a more complex way. In other words, the turn toward behavior, it generates complex and incisive accounts of the ethical dilemmas of everyday individual life. But it does this in a way that often makes it difficult to understand how to move from the task of becoming a better person to the work of building a better world. We can't resolve these dilemmas simply through conceptual analysis, because the old concepts themselves refer to conditions that no longer exist. This is one aspect of how the situation since the Reagan years has changed the relationship between different theories of language and the kinds of social power that they were developed to describe. But it's not the only way. Neoliberalism, as a pattern of economic development, it was always intertwined with other social processes, and perhaps most importantly with technological change. And it's with this theme that I want to briefly conclude. As I've argued, both paradigms, discourse and power, speech and harm, they took shape in the immediate post-war decades. This was a moment of political, social, and economic transformation. It was a global rupture so vast and far-reaching that its shape can still today barely be understood, because it was the beginning of the so-called information revolution. In his 1979 book, The Postmodern Condition, the French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard diagnosed what he saw as a mass crisis of language and of knowledge. So Lyotard described the collapse of the old grand narratives that had grounded Western self-understanding, and he analyzed the new relativism that was apparently taking their place. Now today, it's become fashionable in some quarters to blame the contemporary battles over speech and expression on a so-called postmodernism just run wild. This diagnosis is true, but not in the way that it's usually meant. What the postmodernism trope about our contemporary culture wars forgets is Lyotard's account of why the new crisis of truth emerges at all. It's not because of some just merely cultural nihilism. It's not some pervasive intellectual anarchy. The roots are political and economic. Lyotard argued that in the computerization of society, as he put it, the status of knowledge has changed because of how information itself has become a commodity. The commodification of information, right, in the rise of a digital society, this has fundamentally transformed the quite literal economics of knowledge. And it's shaped how language itself functions as well. The internet is a space of language, among many other things. But the language of the internet isn't quite speech, and it's not quite discourse. It's a new linguistic form, connected to a new economic form. And it's one whose shape and significance we're only beginning to understand. Speech and harm, discourse and power. These kinds of frameworks for comprehending language and the politics of language, they're in crisis today because the linguistic phenomena that they were developed to describe, those things have been eclipsed and reconfigured in the internet age. As this technological transformation of language accelerates, as digital platforms replace our public squares, our classrooms, our lecture halls, as the marketplace of ideas gives way to the commodification of knowledge, we will need new approaches entirely if we're to understand what those older perspectives have helped us begin to see, but can't themselves resolve within our view. My position is this. When we focus on speech, we can look to the idea of harm to guide our moral and political reflections. When we focus on discourse, we can look to power for the same concerns. When we focus on information, what's the corresponding term? What's the new framework that can make sense of our contemporary conditions as those older frameworks made sense of the dilemmas of their time? That's the problem, I think, that confronts us today. It'll change the way we ask our most basic questions about censorship and expression, about ideology, about communication, about knowledge. The critique of neoliberalism isn't enough. It's the starting point for these new concerns, but not the answer to the demands of our time. Today, just as in 1929, as Voloshinov said then, our words themselves index our most dramatic forms of social change. What we will do with those words remains still to be seen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt, for those really thoughtful remarks that I know speak to your ongoing book project, but also beautifully connect to this year-long series we've been having here on free speech. You very nicely structured your remarks around the title and the subtitle of your the title of your contribution, but there's also the contribution of your written work, which you entitled "The Crisis in Language," and you did end by saying more about what you mean by that. But I wonder if we could begin there with this notion of crisis, and just have you say a little bit more about the nature of the crisis and how you're thinking of it, because I hear you saying that both it's hard to bring together the speech harm approach and the discourse power approach. And I also, though, hear you saying that one side seems to be prevailing in our current moment, that we're more comfortable reasoning in the speech harm idiom than the discourse power. And so it's on, with regard to those claims, that I'd like to ask, first set of questions. I'm thinking, first of all, about, why would it be a crisis if one side prevailed to the extent of the other? A more normative question, but then the descriptive question, what are your best pieces of evidence for the idea that this more structural, power-driven types of critique are not as sayable as they used to be? I feel as if personally we're living in a moment where there is more, not less, attention to such structural dynamics like structural or institutional racism. And so, given that issue perhaps, or whatever else you want to attach it to, what is being crowded out, in your opinion, that wasn't as crowded out before? And when was there a time of non-crisis in language, I guess, would be the more broader issue as well.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, that's a really complex set of issues. And I'll try to say something that cuts between them. I agree that the debates about language that we see going on today seem to have a lot to say about structure and about wide-scale patterns, about forms of power, right? But what's striking to me is the way in which the remedies for the kinds of power that they critique, or for the harms that they identify, seem so often to be restricted to the level of like individual behavioral reforms. So for example, when we ask questions about, say, problematic language, right? It's a gesture towards a vision of social power broadly that makes our concerns intelligible, right? Questions about race or class or gender, ableism, and yet so often we start with the gesture to the structural or the systemic, but the only kind of conclusion that we can imagine coming to is a change in what kind of words we use as individuals in our conversations or in our writing or in our tweeting, our activities. And so by the crisis that sort of emerges between the two paradigms, the two frameworks, it's not that I think that either approach has sort of pushed out the other at the level of how we frame our concerns, right? People are clearly deeply concerned about structure, about systematic power. But what is striking to me is how this way in which so often the gesture to the structural can achieve only a criticism of how our behaviors could be better. And it seems to me that it is difficult to know how to think beyond making our own activities more ethical, because we're still struggling to understand how our wider political and economic processes are changing the effects that our words have, right? So if I use if I send a tweet that someone finds offensive in a context totally different than the one that I had imagined the tweet being read in, that's a totally new kind of linguistic interaction, right? And the person might be completely right to see the tweet as offensive or problematic, but it's a response that like it takes on the structure of the old sort of face-to-face encounter, right? Like, oh, you just said something to me that I object to you having said. But of course, it's mediated by a totally different kind of distancing and proximity, a totally new way that words sort of escape their contexts. And I don't think that we yet have the political categories to think about how to reform those kinds of processes, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought it back to your very provocative claim that here in 2021 and in this generation, we're living through not just a crisis of language, but a transformation of language through the computer technological revolution. You say in your written component that language itself is not today any longer what it was, and that the internet is a space of language, but the internet is not quite speech and it's not quite discourse. And that's, I mean, very provocative. And maybe we could just review together a little bit of what you're understanding as being so new. You've said a few things, I think, already. One, I think you were suggesting that there wasn't as clear of a aspiration connected to information, that you don't have the critique of power or the critique of harm. But then you're also saying that there's this decontextualized aspect to internet speech or tweeting that is different. Are there other important things that should be just put under the heading of how it is that the very nature of language is powerfully different in our own time?
Yeah. Okay. So let me walk through a couple aspects of this, sort of thinking out loud about it a little bit. First, just at a sort of purely philosophical level, the question of the internet age in relation to these old categories like discourse and speech, right? Discourse as an idea in late 20th century, like post-structuralist theory, for example, it became a term for like big picture forms of language, intelligibility and unintelligibility, stuff like that. But the term itself has a close connection historically to the idea of text, right? Because text has a kind of permanence beyond the individual act of speaking, right? If I write something down, if I publish something, it can circulate through new contexts. It sticks around for other people's interpretation, even when I'm not there anymore to tell them what it means. You know, that's like where this idea of discourse comes from, is something about language that isn't reducible anymore just to individual interactions. So I want to hold on to that idea about text as a form, right? And then speech, on the other hand, is really closely identified still with individuated like interactions, or with like speaking to an audience, you know, in a context, in a place, whatever. It seems like neither of those ideas, like text in its traditional form and like speech in its also sort of everyday form, neither of them quite captures what we do on the internet, right? If I send a tweet to contribute in a live way to like a conversation that's happening on Twitter, that can feel like speaking, right? But then it sticks around in the way that text does. When I send text messages, it's the same way, right? There's something about digital communication that has something in common with text and something in common with speech. It isn't quite identical to either. That's getting away a little bit from the like political edge of this, but it's like a broader philosophical problem that I think we're still sort of trying to figure out what the right categories are. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that this means is that because we have this new kind of informational communication that isn't quite speech and isn't quite text, our words enter into economic and political processes in new ways. So here's one example. A couple of years ago, there was a legal case in the state of Maine, where the state of Maine had issued some new regulations or passed a new law about privacy protections for internet users in the state, where internet service providers needed to get the sort of explicit permission of their subscribers if they wanted to take the data that their subscribers generated while using the ISP service and sell it to advertisers for advertising customization, right? This feels like a pretty standard kind of privacy protection, right? We're going to require that ISPs get customer permission to sell personal data generated through internet browsing to advertisers. But the ISPs got together and sued the state of Maine on really interesting grounds. The claim was that this restriction on the ability to sell customer information was an infringement of the free expression rights of the ISPs. Because what was being sold, right? It was information, data, something sort of linguistic or quasi-linguistic. And here was the state saying, we're going to restrict what you can do with this sort of pseudo-linguistic data that you've accumulated and collected. This is a kind of question about speech and expression and censorship that couldn't even have been asked a couple decades ago. It's a way that everyday activities and systemic processes like intersect with each other because of technology, that it's not even clear to me we have the legal, let alone philosophical or political categories to conceptualize yet. And so there's a broader set of questions about algorithmic power and the specificity of like information that is really fundamentally transforming these old questions about language and power that I think is part of why it can feel so confusing to know what to do or how to formulate a response to like something happening on the internet that we feel is like problematic at the level of language.
And that points to another dynamic that you're attributing to the contemporary type of speech that's on the rise, the computerized internet speech, which is that it's commodified. And I mean, is that why? Explain why the commodified aspect of speech, like the main case that you're referencing, has this connection to the crisis of language that you're diagnosing. Why does the fact that more of our speech is being bought and sold something that should affect how we understand traditional questions about the boundaries of violence and how speech intersects with violence?
So I think we're still at the frontiers of figuring out how to answer that kind of question. But I'll say this, like it's, you know, everything that I do online becomes a product in a certain way. Like everything that I type out on Facebook, everything that I send in a tweet, everything even that I send, you know, through Gmail, like all of that text that I generates, that I generate becomes part of an advertising profile of me, right? That then gets used to sell things to me, or to, you know, accumulate other kinds of like demographic information, maybe about like where, you know, what kinds of things people who use my ISP are interested in, or whatever else. And this is a way in which our everyday linguistic activities shape our interaction with economic and political forces that is really far-reaching, right? I mean, Shoshana Zuboff's book, Surveillance Capitalism, is like a really influential sort of take on this, right? The way in which like everything we do on the internet is kind of, you know, watched and algorithmically compiled into a portrait of us in the interests of you know, advertising. And so this is what's striking to me is how much this has to do with things that we used to think of as like kinds of language, right? Kinds of speech and text, and how this is a way in which our like everyday linguistic activities become part of sort of broader economic processes. I don't know if that gets at what you're saying, or if there's something that I may be missing in your
No, that's
question.
helpful. It's very helpful. And of course, you know, you're contributing to a contemporary conceptualization of what we're living through in our own lifetimes, but your project, both just your lecture today and your broader book project, What Violence Was, wants to have a more sweeping account of various transformations in the history of the meaning of violence, and also the language of violence, and the violence of language. And I want to turn to a question from Matt Roth at the Mitchell Center, who, thinking of the narrative you're telling, how there was, prior to the discourse power and speech harm constructs, there was this earlier consensus almost about what violence was, that you said, you know, defined violence as outside of the state, connecting it to threats of disorder, threats to the body, threats to property. Matt is asking, both of the newer frameworks oppose a so-called naive view of language as descriptive, objective, or neutral. Are there currently no advocates of this old-fashioned view? In our contemporary, you know, debate about violence and language, and whether language is violent, which you're reminding us is very alive and well, are there advocates today of a more earlier so-called commonsensical approach that are part of the melee?
Oh, there absolutely are. But what's interesting is that the older kind of everyday perspective that language just isn't harmful, right, ends up feeding into the broader debates anyway, right? Because it turns into part of the conversation around the boundaries of, for example, the speech, act, and harm framework. So one way to understand it is that like advocates of the old sort of traditional liberal like Millian idea have a basically similar understanding about speech and harm as people who are really committed to that particular contemporary paradigm, but then they have a disagreement about like where the boundaries of the idea of harm are. And so I think like you know, within any of these frameworks, you can find a range of positions on how to understand the various terms and how to evaluate any given case, right? Like neither the discourse and power approach nor the speech and harm approach tells us what to think in the abstract about any particular linguistic controversy, right? Instead, they're like ways of setting up the questions in the first place. And each of them has a particular way of like recapitulating and like making those older ideas intelligible in new terms and bringing them into the conversation. But they operate really more as like sort of broad tendencies of like how these questions get framed. And only sometimes as like really explicit sort of personal political ideologies that people sort of actively sort of think through in relation to a given question, if that makes sense.
It does. And in a way, I feel like what you've just described maybe opens us up to the next set of questions. There's a few coming about whether the concern with the potential violence of speech is a more left-leaning concern, or put differently, how you would consider, how do you understand conservatives, people on the right, to make sense of these dynamics? So let me just ask you two related questions. One comes again from Matt Roth. How does the divide you describe, and here I think he has in mind again the discourse power, speech harm, play out in conservative and right-wing circles? Are they not widely considered to be two different flavors of left-wing wokeness? In other words, is sort of the conservative approach, neither of those, and maybe more silent on worries about the potential violence of language? Is that true? And then another one coming to us via Gideon Cohn-Pastar, your example of the ISPs in Maine raises the broader issue of how free speech claims have been weaponized by conservatives to strike down things like corporate political donation restrictions. How does their broad definition of speech fit within the paradigm you've described? So both of these questions, I think, are asking you to reflect on the left-right continuum as it might pertain to the debates you're tracing.
Yeah. So this is, let me start with the second part of this about the idea that maybe the right has like weaponized free speech ideas in the interest of, striking down corporate donations or something. I mean, I think what we see here is like the way in which political ideas that emerge in some contexts in the interests of freedom or equality can turn into their own opposites when the conditions that they were developed for no longer exist. I think that we have built an economy in which money is speech. Like, I just think that that's true. Money is speech. Language is a commodity. Knowledge is an economic force. And so, I think that sometimes people on the right are a little more forthright about recognizing that that's the case, even if I myself don't agree with what they think the political response to that should be. Yeah. So I think that maybe I'm losing the.
No, this is good, because you just ended there by referencing that you have a different vision of a political response from certain others in this debate.
Right.
And there's some questions that are really inviting you to say more about this. Maybe you haven't thought it through fully, but you've thought deeply on the transformations of language in our time. And so let me combine these two questions that circle us back to the contemporary moment. One is that just a push from Josh, who writes, so what is your best take on the corresponding word for information, if not power or harm? That's a tricky question, given that you're saying we don't know and we have to search for it. But you just referenced, that you don't share, you're not neutral with regard to the political debates. And so maybe that points you in some direction. And then from Julie Rubin, if we are living in a new age in which information is a commodity, do existing ways of regulating commodities offer insight into how we might deal with information? So Julie's maybe trying to help you answer Josh.
Cool. Yeah. Okay. So this nicely helps me sort of figure out where to go here. I'll say this. I don't have a straightforward answer to like what is the corresponding term for information, like discourse and power, speech and harm, information and what. I think it's a version of the idea of power, right? But it's a kind of power that is new. One of the remarkable facts about the so-called information age is that the infrastructure of everyday life, the things that we sort of rely on to facilitate the equivalent of public experiences, have been far more deeply privatized than was even the case in the Reagan years, right? Think about Zoom, right? Like right now, we're on a privately owned platform that functions as a kind of pseudo-public sphere. Social media platforms operate as public fora, right? And yet they exist as private companies. And this is, I think that we have to understand corporations like Amazon, Facebook, Alphabet, Apple. I think we have to understand them as political entities because they have taken on political functions. They manage public spheres, public squares. They facilitate, they operate the infrastructure of our social interconnection, right? These are tasks that, these are functions, these are institutional goals that we have traditionally in North America and in Europe associated with governing institutions. We've handed them over to private organizations, but that doesn't make those private organizations non-political as a result. Like Google is a quasi-governmental entity in many ways. And Facebook is a quasi-governmental entity in many ways. Facebook even has a sort of quasi-constitutional like process for adjudicating internal conflicts about like which groups should exist or what posts should be removed. And so the answer to what is to be done here is, I think, we have to recognize that these are political organizations. They are forms of quasi-state power in many contexts, and we have to try to democratize them. What that looks like is a very difficult question that we're only beginning to ask, right? Because it's not the case that we can simply, as some people will say, we need to nationalize Facebook, right? Or we need to nationalize Google, but that's just not really possible because these are fundamentally transnational like infrastructures that they manage. But they do need to be democratized. They do need to be, controlled by or influenceable by, controllable by the people who use them, who are affected by them, in the same way that we expect that to be the case of the public institutions that manage our streets. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's such fascination from the questions about your diagnosis of the contemporary moment and also what might be done about it. So let me just throw two more at you that maybe you've already begun to answer in your last set of remarks in talking about how Google and Facebook are quasi-public entities. But one anonymous attendee seems generally persuaded by your remarks, but says, here comes the challenge part. How is someone printing something viewed as problematic and spreading it around much different from someone tweeting the same thing? We already have 500 years of a printing press and the dissemination of text, written text, and also the powerful impact of the print media and the TV media on our political lives. Why is there something so new under the sun as regards to language and the problems we face because of tweeting and something like that? And then another question that comes very close to remarks you had just made, worries about how far dealing with these problems could go. Another anonymous attendee writes, if every word in every language can contribute to structural harms, how can you mitigate that without coming to the conclusion that the state has legitimate purview to regulate nearly everything? So this attendee maybe is detecting some openness to tremendous regulation on your part. You were saying we can't do it nationally, but maybe if we could, you would be all for it, or you'd be for global regulation. How do you assuage, or do you assuage, some of the concerns that I hear, at least in that question?
Yeah. Let me start with this first question, which maybe we could frame as what's so different about like platforms versus presses, right? Like why is something like Facebook different than something like Simon and Schuster like 50 years ago, right? And this is a good question. I think that I'm not sure that it's like so different. I think that what's telling, right, is that the printing press was invented, and then like publishing houses started arising, and then like over time we accumulated a set of like legal principles, around categories like libel, right, and certain related like principles that we use to like adjudicate the questions about what it is permissible to be published, right? And it took time to figure out how to develop those kinds of principles. And I think it'll probably take time to develop, the corresponding set of principles for something like Facebook or Twitter. But of course, what's and it might be the case that like the principles are going to be roughly similar, but of course the mechanisms are different. And this takes us to the second question about like how far can regulation go or whatever. Well, the problem is that like the censorship power, right, is already there. It's just being handled behind closed doors. Right. I don't think that this is a question about like institutions having the power to censor individuals versus not having the power to censor individuals, because I can tweet something that Twitter decides they don't want on their platform, and they can ban me unilaterally. Right. Right now there is far less accountability on social media platforms for anything like democratic principles of like a public check against private power exists far less on Facebook or Twitter than is the case for something like governmental interference with private speech, right? If the state tries to shut down my printing press, there's something I can do about that, right? Like there's a well understood system of like legal institutional routes available to me to push back against state abuses of power like that. Nothing like that exists for Facebook and Twitter, and yet they control way more of our public discourse than probably than like the New York Times does, or than Simon and Schuster does. And so they already have a completely unchecked ability to manipulate public conversation and to exile people from the public from the public square, because they operate as governmental entities over the space of speech without any institutional recourse. This is something that, again, I actually think that there are figures on the political right who have been much more straightforward about recognizing that this is the case with organizations like Twitter and Facebook, but I don't agree with their specific responses to this. But I think that for whatever reason, much of the American political left has had a difficult time like recognizing that like Twitter operates as a tool of state power, of quasi-state power, and has to be thought of as a kind of political institution like that. Yeah.
Great, Matt. I want to not switch, but bring the conversation more closely to the issue of violence. You are a scholar of violence, just completing a book manuscript on it and presenting at a workshop on it on Friday. And one of the main topics of our discussion today is, speech being violent, silence being violent. And tell me if I'm wrong, but I take it that you urge us not to expect to fully answer those questions. That there's not a stable, uncontroversial definition of violence that we should expect to find, that you want to see debates about where the boundaries of violence lie as something that flows out of ongoing political struggles. And I have a couple questions that would stem from this. One is, how do you personally combine that outlook, if that is a crude but fair description of your outlook, with what also seems to be the case, a kind of genuine aspiration for progressive reform, to make the world less shaped by violence and other afflictions as regards a speech and the commodified information speech that we're living through, language. So how do you marry together this, rigorous, careful elaboration of all different ways that violence has been conceived, and your reluctance to tell us what violence is, with what I still take to be an aspiration to cleanse our politics, and in particular, the politics of language, of violent elements?
Yeah, I mean, this is a challenging question. I'm not sure that I'm going to have a totally satisfactory answer, but I think so. I think the fundamental political question is what kinds of power exist that are exercised unjustly and for which there is no form of redress. And sometimes the concept of violence has been really useful in helping us identify those kinds of power, right? Whether that's in private settings like the workplace or the domestic sphere, right? Like the language of domestic violence, right, was a really important way to critique. Has been a really critical way to critique forms of power that operate within the household or in family life, right? For which there was long no redress. It was seen as beyond the scope of the state. Similarly, the concept of structural violence, like illuminated forms of power that operate systemically within society, and helped mobilize certain forms of political opposition to them. I think the point of my work on violence is not to say, oh, we've used the term violence for too many things, or we have to like have a different definition of it than what we do. Instead, what I do is I don't try to settle the debate of how we should understand the term violence. What I do instead is try to track what the different ways of using violence have made visible in politics that weren't visible before. And I think that sometimes we use the concept of violence to ask a question that the concept of violence itself can't give us the answer to. So I think this is the case with structural violence, for example. Like the concept of structural violence has helped illuminate the devastating effects of certain kinds of like patterned discrimination or certain forms of inequality, right? But the concept, but it helps us identify those things, but it doesn't tell us what to do about them, right? We need democratic politics for that. We need organized, political activity. And so the purpose of my work on the concept of violence is actually to try to be clearer than I think sometimes political theorists like myself sometimes want to be about what the limits of conceptual innovation are. Like I just don't think that we actually resolve social problems by like coming up with better definitions of what violence is, for example. I think that sometimes the new definitions help us ask new questions, but we need actual like organized popular power in order to find solutions.
So would you be okay with the efforts to address this allegedly new form of language in our midst, this information-driven, computerized-driven, commodified-driven type of language, as not relying on a notion of violence to reform it? You feel like that's a possibility to you, that the language of violence might muddy things more than clarify them?
Yeah, I think there's a limit to how far we can get with the notion of violence in particular, when it comes to things like internet phenomena. I think that the legacy of like 50 years of debate about like violence and language has better equipped us to ask these new questions about how power operates online and in the world that the internet has created. But I'm actually not super optimistic about how much longer we'll be able to rely on those ideas about violence to like keep asking the most important questions about power in our digital society. Yeah.
Very good. So there's a bunch of questions still in the queue here. I don't want to put you on the spot, but one person would be asking Margaret Hazel if you had any thoughts about the transformation of speech in regards to the Citizens United case, whether that stands out to you, I guess, as an important moment in this neoliberal story you're telling, and how maybe it relates to commodified speech and this move towards information instead of commodified language instead of discourse and speech. And in a very different way, if you want to go a different angle, Abigail Moore is asking about whether conceiving of speech or language in terms of performance is a way to get out of some of the problems that you're elaborating with defining violence. She's thinking of developments out of Austin, for example, Judith Butler's excitable speech,
Mhm.
or Teresa Coloma Beck's semi-phenomenological approach? These are not easy questions,
Yeah.
but it sounds like maybe you do have something to say about one or both of them. If not, I can push forward.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I have something on both. I mean, with Citizens United, look, I mean, to put it bluntly, my political intuitions are Marxian enough that it doesn't surprise me that like forms of political like right respond to developments in economic processes, right? I regard the Citizens United decision as a completely unsurprising like recognition on the part of a jurisprudential body of an already achieved economic fact, which was that in American public life, money is speech. That's just a fact, and the Supreme Court recognized it. That doesn't surprise me. Is it like too bad? Like probably, yeah, it's too bad. But I don't think that our solutions to the kind of problem that Citizens United is sort of associated with, I don't think that our solutions are going to come through like better Supreme Court jurisprudence. I think they're going to come through like broad scale social action, social organizing. And so that's sort of all I can really say about Citizens United, because it's not the level of analysis that I'm primarily interested in here.
Sure.
On performance, yeah, I think that the performativity approach to understanding language is super significant here. I didn't say too much about it beyond like Austin himself in my comments, but one thing that's really striking about Lyotard's postmodern condition text, which is where I sort of first encountered some of these really interesting ideas about the commodification of knowledge in a technologically transforming society. One thing that's really interesting is, Lyotard really builds on Austin's idea of performative speech to talk about how in a technological society that's like organized as fundamentally by communication processes as by anything else, like one of the effects is that what Austin called the performative power of speech is like super really directly part of how actual economic processes work. Now, his like account of this is complicated, and I probably shouldn't try to like recapitulate it in full here. But I do think that there's something really significant about this performativity idea in relation to language, because I think that when language is commodified, when communications technology becomes so significant to the overall structure of the economy and the overall structure of politics, if it is indeed the case that language has performative force, which I think is true, Austin was right about this, if that's the case, and if language itself has taken on new structuring significance in political economy as a whole, which I think is also true because of the commodification of knowledge, then yeah, performativity is gonna like have a new kind of social significance. And I think that figures like not just Austin, but figures like Lyotard and Butler have been really significant to developing those ideas. And I think that there's a lot still to be done in terms of understanding how that works in digital technology in particular. Yeah.
Great. There is really a lot of continued interest in your diagnosis of the contemporary situation, and hearing you speak just now about a kind of maybe Marxist critique that you might be sympathetic to, and money versus power as not just a jurisprudential principle that money is protected as speech in the American regime, but phenomenologically we know that money is speech, and that the wealthy have disproportionate opportunities for influencing politics and so forth. It strikes me that dynamic predates the information revolution, the internet, the early 21st century, and is quite ancient, perhaps. But perhaps what you're pointing to is the pernicious overlap of a long-standing plutocratic dimension in even democratic politics and the computer technologies, and that you're suggesting that there's an intimate link between computerization and neoliberalism. But with all that in mind, Andrew Liu, I do want to go to Andrew Liu, but I also wanted to ask a question about from an anonymous attendee. Your discussion of information seems to miss the role of different communication layers on the internet: physical, code, content. how do these layers map onto the categories of speech and text? So inviting you to go into more of the nitty-gritty of the information revolution, computerized language, and so forth.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And one of the things that I think is striking is like how inadequate our existing legal and political categories are for asking precisely that kind of question. So like with the ISP case in Maine, right? There was no significant distinction able to be drawn there between like, you know, information about ISP customers derived from the text that they, you know, write versus the like metadata of their browsing habits versus the, you know, other levels at which they like interact with communications infrastructure. It's just a kind of data aggregate, right? That turns into a kind of advertising profile. And yeah, I you know, to be honest, I don't yet have a particularly like clear sense myself of whether the political questions are going to operate differently at those different levels, right? Like code versus whatever else. But that's honestly the kind of question that I'm interested in turning to in my future work, because I think it's, you know, the case law so far has not like led to a clear set of categories there. So that doesn't really answer the question, but I think it's the right question.
We are heading towards the end of our time, and we will share with you the questions we couldn't get to, but let me continue to ask you a question now from Andrew Liu. You know, your work is so theoretical and historical, but there's also a policy or, you know, or very contemporary, what should we do in our laws and politics element to what you're getting at. And so Andrew Liu in this vein is asking, can the public goods framework be applied to regulating entities like Facebook and Google, with information being the public good? So now maybe information would be less pernicious as a concept. It is conceived as a public good.
Oh, so I absolutely do think that information needs to be conceived of as a public good. Yeah. I think one of the things that concerns me about the way sort of critical political discussion of the information age has gone is that, like, look, I'm totally sympathetic, as I think is probably clear, to like the like big tech skeptics or whatever, right? You know, the people like Zuboff who think that, like, you know, there's this massive problem of surveillance and whatever else. But I also think that information is fundamentally a public good, and that if we understand this in a one-sided way as, like, you know, the manipulations of algorithms or the, you know, built-in surveillance of social media or whatever else, we're gonna miss how radical the transformation actually is. The rise of the internet is a social transformation at the level of how our, like, proximity works, of how social, like, distance and closeness is structured. It's probably the most dramatic such revolution in the structure of social space since the invention of the city. And when you have something that dramatic, right, concepts like surveillance and privacy, anonymity and publicity, they're very content changes, right? When the city arises for the first time, a new kind of privacy becomes possible in visibility, right? The privacy of the crowd. That wasn't possible in, like, rural life or in, like, pre-urban or non-urban life. There is no privacy in visibility until you have the city, right? Which is a new organization of social space that changes the very, like, possibility of privacy, anonymity, and of course surveillance as well. The internet is I think a transformation of social space at that level of fundamentality. And I'm deeply sympathetic to the kind of critical approach that you know, people like Zuboff have taken, that emphasize that there's you know, surveillance is part of what's going on. But I think what that risks missing is that the very concept of surveillance and the very content of privacy as a good is going to be transformed by this in ways that we're still only beginning to see. And so I do think we have to hold on as well to like the idea of information as a public good. Information is something that has to be democratized, that has to be made accessible to people, rather than seen as just a tool of control or of domination or manipulation or surveillance. I think that the public goods framework as a policy framework has its own limitations, right? Because its own concepts are going to be transformed in this way. But it has to be held on to just as much as the like surveillance kind of sensibility does as well, because the internet is a good thing, right? Like this event can happen, right? This kind of thing is possible. And there's no going back. And so we have to figure out like what the best way to like have freedom and equality in this new kind of social space is, rather than say, oh, this is just a new kind of like manipulation and control.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a wonderful way to wrap up. I'll just give you the chance to say any last words you want to offer, but it strikes me that this last exchange is really fascinating. Your analogy to the birth of the city itself not only reminds us of just how revolutionary the transformations going on with regard to technology and speech are in our current moment, but maybe it's a suggestion that when you use the language of crisis, you don't always mean to do so as we're heading towards disaster. That crisis could be more neutral, at least, and have some just pure change without a negative valence, although the language of neoliberalism seems more infused by pure critique and negativity.
And this is why I think that the idea of the critique of neoliberalism is just a starting point. It's not, we can't get at the political possibilities of the information age just by thinking about like the idea of neoliberalism, because there's so much more going on than that. And this is the other side of the way in which like I have a certain intellectual debt to the Marxian tradition, that crisis is always understood as opportunity and as new possibility as well. Mm-hmm. And so I want to thank both you and everyone in the audience for sort of bearing with me as I think through what are still for me provisional ideas. I have come to this conclusion that partly by studying how the idea of violence has changed and what it's made possible, and also what it's not any more adequate for. I've come to this idea that we need some new terms for political theorization and for political action. In my work now, having sort of finished, my book about the history of the concept of violence, I want to now turn more directly to what new ideas should take its place. And this has been a great way to start thinking about that more actively. So my thanks to you, Jeff.
Well, thank you, Matt. I mean, it's really remarkable how you're able to think on your feet about such complicated matters and do so eloquently, both with regard to issues I know you have been working on for years in your presentation today, but also throughout this past year at the Mitchell Center with regard to other people's presentations. The way you've synthesized questions has been wonderful. And I just want to thank you and Gideon Cohen-Postar, the other postdoctoral fellow at the center, for being such wonderful, proactive and engaged citizens of the center and Penn more generally. We will miss you and look forward to keeping in touch in the next phases of your careers. And as this is the last event of the Free Speech Battles series, I just want to say a special thank you again to Sigal Ben-Porath for her amazing leadership of this whole initiative. It's been a tremendous amount of work that she's given to conceive of and execute and participate in all of the events that we've had this year. I know you're out there somewhere, Sigal. Let me just say that it's hard to believe, but we started talking about the series in 2018. And right around that time, you had just finished your book, Free Speech on Campus, which has gotten so much attention. And now here we are in 2021, and you're a fellow at Harvard on a so-called sabbatical year, finishing a book, I understand, on open expression and civic dialogue. And I hope you personally have found these discussions the past year generative for you in your own cutting-edge research on these themes of free speech and the controversy surrounding them. I certainly know that I myself and so many of us who have tuned in for the last many months, and it's been hundreds of people, have benefited tremendously from the program that you've led. So we look forward to continuing to work together, but it's been wonderful. Thank you so much, Sigal.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone. We'll conclude then for today, but You have Matt Schaefer's contact information on his Penn webpage if you want to get in touch with him, and we'll share questions of yours that we were not able to ask him right away after this call. But take care and see you next time.